Hello and welcome to World Talks with me, Ashim Kumar. The Trump administration and a bipartisan group of US senators say that they've reached agreement on sweeping new sanctions targeting Russia and countries that continue buying its oil and gas. Is this the toughest economic pressure campaign yet, or another measure that Moscow has already learned how to absorb? Well, Mark Toth, co-founder of Interep 360 and a regular contributor, joins us. Mark, good to see you. Welcome back.
Ashim, great to see you as well, and greetings to your viewers.
Thank you. So talk us through what's happened here. We've got a bipartisan group of senators. They've agreed tighter sanctions on Russia. What brought it on?
Ashim, this has been a long road in the making to get to this point. This legislation, SR 1241, as it's known in the Senate, but basically the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025, was first introduced in April of 2025. The Senate delayed actually moving it forward procedurally to give Trump time to negotiate with Putin. That idea maybe have been a good one, not to tie the president's hands early on, failed. It was very clear that Putin was not going to negotiate a peace deal, at least on equitable terms, with Ukraine, and he kept stalling that process. And so I think what we saw happen in Kiev yesterday with this announcement by Senator Graham that he had finally reached an agreement with Trump that he will support and sign the legislation is key. Now, granted, it still has to be fully passed by the House and Senate, and Trump still yet has to sign it. So it's not quite time to take a victory lap yet. But the people that are supporting it are extremely powerful. You've got Graham himself, who's the chairman of the Budget Committee, a very powerful committee in the United States Senate. You have Senator Wicker, who's the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who's also extremely powerful. He chairs that. And then on the Democratic side, you also have Jeanne Shaheen, the senator, who's also sits as the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And for people not familiar with the U.S. Senate concept, that means she's the senior most Democrat on there. So she holds a lot of sway within her own party. And then obviously the original co-sponsor, Senator Richard Blumenthal, is also a key member. He's the ranking member of the Veterans Party. So there's a lot of heft there, a lot of political heft that enabled 83 people, if I recollect correctly, to sign on immediately. There's strong bipartisan support for this. And this is, in your lead up to this segment, if I may add here real quickly, this is the strongest sanctions that the U.S. can do. They're basically known as secondary sanctions. They have a lot of teeth, and it's going to be very difficult for Russia to avoid them.
Right. OK. So what's involved? You mentioned secondary sanctions, but what does that mean?
Right. Secondary sanctions basically says if this does get enacted and Russia refuses to do some things, such as doesn't negotiate a peace settlement with Ukraine, violates any kind of peace deal that they do with Ukraine, or, for instance, if a peace deal gets done and they re-invade Ukraine at some point, it directs the president, meaning he has to do it, to implement secondary sanctions. And basically what secondary sanctions are is saying to anyone that does business with the United States, if you purchase Russian oil and gas, the other provision is for uranium, then we're going to sanction all of your imports into the United States at least 500% tariff. Now, unlike the tariffs that many people might have heard about in the last year or so, that the courts here in the United States have argued were illegal because Congress hadn't approved them, these would be very legal. They would be constitutionally sound, and the president would have to do that. Not just Trump, but any future president. So the fact that we're at this point, the fact that these secondary sanctions, would basically essentially say to key trading partners around the world, you can do this. You continue to purchase Russian oil and gas or purchase uranium from Russia, but then every business that you do with the United States is going to be sanctioned heavily. The biggest countries that would be affected by that are China and India because they buy massive amounts of Russian oil and gas. And then any other countries that are purchasing uranium for the nuclear power plants. So it does have a lot of heft, a lot of teeth. and it would be effective. We've already seen that. China already, in many cases, individual companies backed off, even when these illegal sanctions, if you will, were in effect. And I think these would work. This is what all of us have been long calling for in the United States, because we know this is the greatest sanctions that can be in place, and they literally are the kind of sanctions that could be the tipping point that causes the regime in Moscow to fail.
Right. Well, of course, that's one enormous part of this whole picture. But the other part, of course, is the impact it's going to have on China, because China needs to sell to the US and European markets. And it's caught between a rock and a hard place here, because if it continues buying a cut price oil and gas from Russia, it's going to pay a price on its exports. What do you think their response is going to be?
Yeah, Ishim, great point, because it is going to be a dilemma for China. And I'd also add India as well. Just given the amounts of oil that they purchased over time at discounts, which has helped fuel their economy. I don't think China's going to have much of a choice, though. It's basically a case where the trade that they have with the United States and the trade that they have with Europe, I think you have to add the European Union into this, the Joint Economic Community Association, because it would be affected too. China won't have any choice but to say, hey, we've got to support these sanctions. That doesn't mean that there won't be some back channel deals. That doesn't mean that Russia can't try to use its shadow fleet, as it's been doing, to circumvent some of these. But I think in general, at least at the biggest levels, if these secondary sanctions ever get implemented, then China would basically have to say uncle, because the economic damage to their own economy would be too great.
Right. Now, these sanctions apply to oil and gas from Russia, but there is also another type of trade going on between the two countries, where China is actually supplying dual-use components to Russia for use in its war against Ukraine. Is there any chance that that trade might be limited using similar tools?
Yeah, there is a provision, and again, it will take the final agreement between reconciliation, as it's known, between the House and Senate versions that calls for any kind of military assistance to Russia in a time where it's still either, actively at war with Ukraine or has reinvaded the country, than any country providing military assistance. And that would include dual use, as you pointed out, technologies that either can be used for civilian or military purposes. That would become part of this. And that would also have teeth. Because obviously Russia's defense industry at this point can't meet up with its own needs, despite becoming a war economy several years ago when it went on a war footing. Its demand, because of the losses in Ukraine, can't keep up with the supply. I'm sorry, the supply can't keep up with the demand. And so that would be another critical way of wounding Putin and his war machine, and effectively saying, look, you need to negotiate an end in Ukraine, because your economy is going to start to grind to a halt, and then so will too your military.
Right. Now, Mark, I want to talk about the change in the relationship between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. We have the infamous meeting in Washington when President Zelensky visited President Trump, and President Trump said, he had no cards to play. However, at their meeting, the NATO summit in Ankara, which has just ended, it was a completely different rapport between the two men, wasn't there? What happened?
Yeah, Ishim, that's a great question. This is almost like a Hollywood movie where you start out thinking X is going to happen, and then you've got the plot twist at the end. Certainly, and part of this is what prompted this action, the legislation action in April by Senator Graham, a strong supporter of Ukraine. Friday was his 10th visit to the country since the war began. You had the infamous blow up in February of 2025 with Zelensky and Trump in the White House. And now, such an abrupt turnaround where, even the body language, if you look at the pictures of the two men, these were two men that went from basically hating each other in the White House to two people that look like they're best friends. Now, that is Trump, however, though. He tends to get in rooms with people, and just based on his mood, he's either your best friend or your worst enemy. So I wouldn't overread into it, but it was definitely a good sign. His actions, to me, are what we probably should be paying attention to. And the fact that Trump actually actually approved licenses, which has been a contentious issue. The idea that we're going to give we being the United States, are going to give the Patriot license for them to produce their own interceptor missiles is a huge, burden lifted off of Ukraine, because their industry has proven that they can be very creative. They can bring these type of products to the market very quickly and get them on the battlefields. And so that is, to me, what is most amazing about that meeting in Ankara, is that Zelensky secured something that a lot of us have been calling for a long time. I think drones are playing a big issue here. I think over time, maybe by osmosis, as Trump has sat in on his presidential briefings from the military, he started to recognize that, look, the battlefield is changing in the future. We've seen it, obviously, in a big way with the drones and their uses in Ukraine, the deep strikes those have been able to accomplish in the Russian motherland. But we've also seen it against U.S. forces in the Mideast. And I think Trump is starting to understand that there's real strategic value between growing the military relationship between the United States industrial complex, if you will, with Ukraine's technology that is getting adapted in real time. And you can't replace that kind of knowledge. It's something very valuable to U.S. defense firms. So this just may be the perfect storm, a shame that's coming together. And it's a good one. I hope it continues.
Right. Well, as you say, Mark, in the last minute or so, it is the perfect storm. We've got the secondary sanctions. We've got the licensing of interceptor missiles to Ukraine. That's likely to change the balance even further in Ukraine's favor in its war against Russia. Do you think it will work in bringing Putin to the negotiating table?
Shim, that's a great question. I think at a strategic level where it counts most, it is going to work because it's going to continue to allow Ukraine to press its advantage. The more that it continues to take its deep fight, it's hit all 11 of Russia's major oil and gas refineries now. As far away as Siberia, 2,500 kilometers, an impressive feat. As long as they keep pressing that advantage and they have a better way of defending their citizens to avoid the attacks that we just saw overnight, kids in a park getting hit by debris, a couple in a restaurant, the blast of a window breaking through. That is the real way that it's going to win. Whether Putin agrees that this is the closing deal, I'm just not so sure. I'm not so sure this guy just doesn't wait too long. Classic leader in the bunker who doesn't get the reality outside. But one way or the other, it will lead, in my opinion, to Ukraine's victory.
Well, we look forward to that. Mark, unfortunately, we're being beaten by the clock, as often happens with us. But thank you very much for sharing your analysis with our audience, and have a wonderful day.
Great. Always my honor, Ashim. Greetings.
Thank you, Mark. Cheers. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.